Hello and welcome to the very first session in the virtual Sustainable Packaging Summit. As you probably know, we planned to meet in Lisbon for this event, but that hasn't been possible, and we've had to translate our vision for a two-day summit into a virtual program. One of the first decisions we made was that we didn't really want to cram all of the discussions that we had planned into 2 days of digital content. So instead, we're presenting this summit as a season of panels, workshops, and networking events that's running throughout the autumn of this year. Everyone who's signed up to today's session is very welcome to join us for all or any of the future sessions, and you can find the details of all of these on the platform. We'll also be adding some more events to the program over the coming days. Other than that, the basic vision for the Sustainable Packaging Summit hasn't really changed. This is intended as a platform for meaningful discussion of crucial environmental questions that FMCG and packaging need to confront, with an emphasis on constructive interaction, not a series of corporate mission statements. Over the course of the next few weeks, we'll be addressing the fundamental objectives and strategic approaches to sustainability, looking at practical challenges, and also at new ideas and innovations that can drive progress. Today's panel is going to be focusing on the first of these. We're going to be asking ourselves, what are the fundamental sustainability goals we set for packaging? Over recent years, we've seen a great deal of attention on the packaging waste crisis, but I'd argue rather less focus, at least in the context of FMCG and packaging, on carbon emissions. Do we as an industry have the right priorities? And assuming we aspire to both avert climate crisis and to end the pollution of our natural environment, how should the task of decarbonization inform our approach to the task of eliminating packaging waste? I'm delighted to be joined today by a panel of leaders in both thought and action with different vantage points on these questions. So I'd like to welcome Nina Goodrich, who's Director of the Sustainable Packaging Coalition, Archana Jagannathan, who's Senior Director of Sustainable Packaging at PepsiCo, Gerald Rebitzer, who is Director of Sustainability at Amcor Flexibles, and Erik Lindroth, who is Sustainability Director at Tetra Pak. As I said, our focus in the Sustainable Packaging Summit is on interaction. So we would very much like you, the audience, to share your questions for the panel, and we'll try to answer these at the end. You can do this by sharing questions on LinkedIn or Twitter. You can simply go to the Packaging Europe LinkedIn or Twitter pages, and the pinned post at the top of those pages will be the place where you can share your questions. Alternatively, just use the hashtag Sustainable Packaging Summit. So I'll give you a reminder about that later, but please do send in your questions for the panelists on LinkedIn and Twitter. So let's get started and meet the panelists themselves. First of all, Nina Goodrich, can I ask you to briefly introduce your work and the role that the Sustainable Packaging Coalition plays?
Yes, thank you, Tim, and thank you for having me on this panel. Looking forward to our conversation. So the Sustainable Packaging Coalition brings together stakeholders across the value chain. We're moving towards 500 members, which is very exciting. And the membership breaks down to be about a quarter raw material suppliers, a quarter converters, quarter brands and retailers, and then other folks from government, industry, academia are all part of the membership and the journey around the conversation of what can we do to make actionable differences. So it's a collaborative, but it's focusing on education and action in the sustainable packaging space. And we like to think about 4 major areas. We like to think about sourcing and ensuring that, and that comes in whether it's plastic or whether it's paper. Material health, there's no point in having something be circular if it's not safe. Optimization of the package, and then also recovery. So we tend to work across those 4 different areas with our membership.
Thank you, Nina. And we should also give a special thank you to Nina for getting up heroically at 3 o'clock in the morning to join us, because she's based on the west coast of the States. So thank you for that. Archana Jagannathan, welcome to the panel. Could you give us a little overview of PepsiCo's key sustainability objectives?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Tim. Thank you for having me on this panel today. And likewise, I'm looking forward to a really interesting discussion. Most of your audience would know PepsiCo as a manufacturer of carbonated soft drinks, but we also have a huge snacks portfolio with Lay's, Walker's, Doritos. We have a nutrition portfolio with Tropicana, with Quaker Oats, and all of those have very different packaging needs and very different packaging types. And our mission in PepsiCo is to make sure that none of this packaging need become a waste. However, to the point that you were making earlier on carbon, we've also signed the UN pledge for the 1.5 degrees reduction, and that means very aggressive climate targets for us. We know the food system accounts for about 30% of total carbon emissions, and packaging is not an insignificant part of that. So we are trying to balance various different environmental concerns, important amongst them being waste and also carbon reductions. And we do that through what we call a 3R strategy, which is reducing the amount of plastic we use, simply just using the minimum amount that's required to keep the product safe till it reaches the consumer. And that involves lightweighting bottles, reducing the size of our chip bags, etc. The second R is recycle, and that starts from making our packaging fully recyclable, compostable, or biodegradable, but also involves closing the loop and using recycled content back in our packaging. We've recently announced that we're going to go to 100% recycled PET in UK and Germany, but that's just the first step, and we want to be able to close the loop and drive circular economy for all of our packaging. And the third R is reinvent, and that's really driving innovation in new business models like SodaStream, but also new materials like the paper bottle consortium we've just joined, or also new technologies in the value chain. And a good example there is the Holy Grail consortium with 86 companies, and that's an enhanced sorting technology. So it's really about reducing, recycling, and reinventing. So we meet those dual objectives of both reducing waste, but also reducing carbon emissions through all of our actions.
Thank you, Archana. Gerald Rebitzer, let's introduce the third member of our panel. Could you tell us about Amcor's sustainability targets and pledges?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Hello, everybody. For the people who don't know, Amcor is basically the world's largest packaging company. We are market leader in rigid packaging in North and South America, and globally in flexible packaging. I personally work mainly in flexible packaging, where obviously we have a lot of challenges in terms of sustainability. What I should say, you know, the sustainability program in Amcor goes back more than 15 years. So we have made it a priority for quite a while to really work on selecting the right materials for the job, basically focusing a lot on efficiency. And then in some geographies also on recycling where that infrastructure actually existed. I think what came to life in the last years, this really requirement of circular economy, recyclability, reusability. I think very similar to what Archana from PepsiCo was mentioning. You're really making sure that those materials also become circular. And I think we see it in a way, it's a new kind of guarding requirement. It's like the packaging has to work. It has to have the functionality. You know, it has to be safe, etc. And if you will, then the requirement for it to be able to be, you know, collected, sorting, and recycled that's now also a hard requirement, not a nice to have. And I think from our point of view, we have about 1,000 people working in R&D. And this is kind of a key requirement that complements the normal set of requirements like functionality and quality. And more than or almost 3 years ago, we basically came out with our pledge, similar to what Archana has presented, to make sure that all packaging by 2025 can be recycled or can be reused. And then on top of that, obviously working also on incorporating post-consumer recycled content and working with others on the infrastructure piece. In Europe, specifically, C-Flex is something to mention, where we have over 160 companies from the flexible packaging value chain, really, driving this piece, because our view is you need the right design. That's kind of the necessary condition. And then it's about having the right infrastructure, which is then the sufficient condition to meet the circular economy guidelines and goals.
Thank you, Gerald. And let's introduce our fourth panelist, Erik Lindroth from Tetra Pak. Could you tell us, Erik, about Tetra Pak's key sustainability targets?
Thank you, Tim, and good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. At Tetra Pak, we work under the umbrella, we call it the low carbon circular economy, which fundamentally is a life cycle perspective on our activities and our products. So in this scope, we continuously ask ourselves three key questions, I think, in the way that we work and the way that we develop and produce and sell our products. And those three questions are: what are the raw materials that we're using? What is the impact during the life cycle? And what happens to a package once it's empty? So if we can answer those three, sustainability becomes an asset for us to use together with customers. But if not, it becomes a risk to manage. So it's important to take that full scope for us. And just a few examples on the raw material side, we're working to increase the use of plant-based renewable plastics in our packages. We're working to get recycled content in there. We're working with independent certifications when it comes to the supply chain, so responsible supply. Throughout the life cycle, we work to improve the equipment that we sell as well, the filling equipment, the distribution solutions, and logistics to make sure that it happens in an efficient way. And then on the final part, on the recycling, we work with partners in the industry and also with local governments to increase the availability of collection infrastructure, to increase the amount of packaging that does get collected, and also to make sure that there is recycling capacity there, to make sure that the packages can be recycled and turned into new products. So low carbon circular economy, full life cycle view, that's sort of encompasses everything for us.
Thank you, Erik. So let's get straight into the fundamental question of today's panel, which is: how do we define sustainability as far as packaging is concerned, and what should our basic sustainability goals and priorities be? As I said in the introduction, there's been fierce concentration on packaging waste over recent years, and huge and justified public concern about ocean plastics and these related issues. But we don't hear, at least on a kind of consumer media political level, quite so much about carbon emissions, at least in terms of the packaging context, probably because it's not the visible part of packaging. You can see the waste, but you can't see the carbon footprint. It might be worth mentioning at this juncture that we had a not very scientific LinkedIn poll that Packaging Europe conducted for our audience on LinkedIn, and we asked them what is the #1 priority that drives your organization's packaging sustainability objectives. We gave them 3 options: packaging waste reduction, carbon crisis, or both of the above. And interesting results, again, not scientific, but still interesting. The 49% of respondents said packaging waste was their #1 priority. Only 7% said carbon crisis. However, 42% did say both of the above. So I guess you can read that both ways. Either waste reduction is clearly #1, or the basically half of the audience is saying that either carbon or both carbon and waste are equally important. Archana, can I ask you first? Let's put this question in very crude terms. Which is more important than the other? And I suppose a less crude practical question is there an inevitable tension between targeting carbon and targeting waste reduction?
Yeah, great point, Tim. I'm intrigued by the results of your survey. I would say very much in your option 3 camp, which is both of those are equally important. And that's what makes this such a complex area and such a complex topic to solve. Having said that, I don't think they are necessarily inconsistent with each other. So if you think about reducing packaging, that reduces waste, that also reduces carbon impact. If you think about driving a circular economy and driving recycling, that ultimately reduces waste, but we also know that the recycled content has a significantly lower carbon impact than virgin content, certainly virgin fossil fuel-based content. So I don't think the two are necessarily inconsistent. Having said that, there are always trade-offs that we have to make in order to make sure that there are no unintended consequences of any decisions that we're making, and we're always balancing both of those goals as we think about any decision we make on changing packaging or alternate packaging.
Thank you. Nina, would you like to respond to that?
Absolutely. One of the things that SBC has is a goals database, and we're just in the process of updating that. And I'm very curious to see when the results come out, how that has changed. But at our last look at about a year ago, there were companies that had carbon goals at the corporate level, but very rarely were they linked to the packaging strategy. And I'm expecting that we're going to see a big difference that's hopefully more in line with your poll. But one of the things that I always think about is when we think about package optimization, sometimes we're taking the package out of its context of the job that it's hired to do, which is to protect that product. Whether it's a food product or whether it's a durable, the carbon footprint of the product inside the package is always bigger. And sometimes I think we lose sight of that when we're thinking about the package. So it's really important that we keep the overall, I think, Erik, you mentioned this in your introduction, the overall system, the packaging system and the carbon associated with the delivery of that product, the use of that product, and then the end of life. So I think that's something that's key when we want to think about carbon. And I also agree with the idea that the more recycled content, sort of all materials can be lower carbon footprint with the use of recycled content. So from that perspective, that pushes that lever as well. So what we don't want are these unintended consequence trade-offs out of not knowing.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Gerald, can I ask you about this? Do you see one as more important than the other? And how can we optimize our response so that we do avoid these trade-offs?
Well, I think what is more important, if I talk about the sustainability as a sustainability professional and also private citizen, honestly, I would say climate change, clearly, it's much more important, because if we don't solve that, waste is a minor problem. But obviously, I think it depends on the audience, what everybody is working on, what everybody can influence. But in my way, I think really, also what Erik mentioned, we see it in a way, holistically. And if we think about the overarching goal is sustainability, or maybe we should actually go back and call it sustainable development. There was recently a nice post by Mina Mistry, who used to work for SPC as well, who made some good comments on that it's really, sustainable development, developing into the future in a sustainable way. And if the term itself is over 300 years old, I looked it up before that, it came from Karlowitz, like in Germany in 1713, where it was about protecting the forest, where people relied on the forest for, for housing, for cooking, for energy, for pretty much everything. And they basically realized if we continue like that, all of Europe at one point was the forest. The forest is gone, and then they don't have their livelihood. And then they realized that concept, okay, you only take out as much wood out of the forest as that is replanted again. And I think to get to a stable system, and I think that is what probably we should all have as an overarching goal. And then you need to make sure what are the different elements in sustainability, what we need to be driving for, where on a global level, climate change is definitely the biggest challenge. If we, in probably 50 years or so at the latest, if we don't tackle that in a serious way, then the pandemic is nothing. It's a walk in the park against what will happen with climate change. And it will also not go away by a vaccine or anything. That will probably stay for a few hundred years. So I think that's what we have to keep in mind. And therefore, I think, obviously, we need to work on holistic concept, keeping sustainability life cycle, keeping the full package and the product in mind. Someone a few years ago had this saying, it's much more important what the packaging does than what it is. So we need to make sure that it protects the content, it protects that and minimizes the overall product, and then obviously solve the waste issue. And I agree with my other panelists, if you do it in the smart way, they go hand in hand. Like you should not do upgauging to meet some recycling design requirements that you minimize, let's say, the unrecyclable part, but really look for solutions where recycling, circular economy, reusability contributes to that overall goal of sustainability and minimizes life cycle impact. So I see circularity as a tool to be used within sustainability, with the focus on waste, obviously, and resources. The other part is obviously the whole resource question. If we need less resources, less energy to produce them, that's a big saving in terms of climate change.
Thank you, Gerald. Erik, could I ask you, do you see a dichotomy where it comes to waste reduction versus climate crisis measures?
I think it's a yes and no kind of answer. So there is the conflict in this, in that, I mean, if you look at the circular economy as a concept, it sort of lands at the end of life discussion almost always, unfortunately, but it just disregards the life cycle perspective on this. So if you just focus on the end of life as the only thing you discuss with circular economy, you will end up talking about waste and waste and waste and nothing else. But I think the bigger question here is really that we need to focus on the whole life cycle. And actually the most important decision we can take is the raw material that we decide to start to employ for our products from the first place. And there we need to get away from the fossil economy. I think that is clear. So I fully agree with the others that climate change, I mean, Gerald, what you were talking about, I think it's so paramount. And I also like what you said, Gerald, what packaging is more what it does than what it is. And I think I fully agree to that, because packaging as such is kind of a funny product because it has a physical manifestation, but if you look at what it does, that it's actually a distribution service. It takes a product, a food product, for example, from the place of production to the place of consumption in a safe way. So it has a bigger role to play. And then you use material to be able to render that service. And then you may have to make the material choices as smart as possible. And for us, that is about maximizing the renewable plant-based content. It about including also recycled content in there, so we get a good start from the beginning. Because one thing is clear, we cannot recycle our way out of the climate crisis. I mean, the discussion starts much earlier. So yeah, we have to have this holistic approach or full life cycle approach. Otherwise, you will make a lot of sub-optimizations along the route. which benefits no one in the end, to be honest. So I think, yeah, I fully agree. Climate is there. It is it's the big one, but it also includes recycling, because if we don't do recycling, that will have a negative climate impact as well. So you have to close the loops and make sure that material is used for new products as well. So I think it's both.
Just Tim, can I just maybe add a comment? That's because Erik said, obviously, exactly, if it's only end of life, it's kind of an end of pipe technology. So you start dealing with the problem there. We have to do it much earlier. And the point is, obviously, like you said, it's very visible at the end of life, and any form of littering and any form of disposal that's not appropriate has to be absolutely avoided. But one also, if you look at life cycle assessment, etc., if you have 1 pound or 1 kilogram of waste at the end, where you have packaging waste or whatever, actually there is much more waste created during the life cycle of producing and using that. So even energy, like 1 kilowatt hour produced by coal produces about 100 grams of waste, some of that even toxic waste. It's not the waste that people see in their bin, but it's waste. So I think it's really clearly interconnected, and that's why one needs to focus on the whole picture.
To just jump in there, Tim, maybe an example might help to bring this to life, what Erik as well as Gerald and Nina were talking about. I very often get asked the question on single-use packaging versus reusable glass packaging. And my answer is always, it depends. And I'll tell you why it depends, because those are just words on a page. And the life cycle assessment of it depends on the context in which those systems operate. A single-use packaging that operates in an environment with high collection, high sorting, high recycling, and that uses the recycled content is very, very different in impact from exactly the same single-use packaging format or material that operates in an environment where it isn't collected, where it isn't sorted, and isn't recycled. And similarly for reusable glass, we all know glass is much heavier than plastic, therefore like for like the carbon impact is heavier. But if you look at the whole system, it depends on how many times is that package reused, how long does it have to travel between the cleaning and filling location and the consumption location, what is the mode of transportation that's used, what's the breakage in the process. And one system can be very different from another depending on the context in which it operates. And so we always need to think about it as, what's the material we're using, but also what's the infrastructure and what's the context in which this operates. If there was a silver bullet answer, everyone in the industry would have adopted it by now, but there isn't, and that's why the problem is complex, and we're all working together to solve it.
Absolutely, Archana, and it's great that we can move on to this question of I think everyone agrees that we need to focus on both decarbonization and eliminating packaging waste in the environment, and therefore we need to think in circular terms. But I guess if we set decarbonization as either the ultimate goal or a prerequisite alongside eliminating waste, we need to look at the challenge of the circular economy through the lens of what are the carbon impacts. And obviously we have a lot of different visions of what circularity means. So we're going to spend time talking about recycling single-use packaging in this panel. We're also seeing a lot of discussion of reuse and development of a lot of reusable packaging models. In fact, we'll have a panel talking about that topic next week. We also obviously have a lot of people who think that switching to renewable materials is, a core tenet of circularity. And we need to find ways of adjudicating which are the best options. I'm sure no one would argue on this panel that there's always one silver bullet. I think we would all agree with Archana there, but we still need to have better methodologies and systems for making those choices. I think I'll mention another very unscientific Packaging Europe LinkedIn poll here, where we asked our audience about the different impacts that different systems might have within a circular economy on environmental impacts. So we asked which vision of a circular economy has the most positive environmental impact. We gave them the following options: universal recycling, switching to reusable containers, switching to renewable materials, or a combination of the above. And perhaps the last option gave everyone the opportunity to not really answer. So 63% said a combination of the above, which is both wise as an answer and a way of sitting on the fence, I suppose, isn't it? But anyway, 19%, the largest of the others, said universal recycling. Switching to reusable containers was 7%, and switching to renewable materials was 11%. So let's focus on this question of how we can identify the right solutions for individual applications. Nina, you have a huge group of stakeholders looking at these questions. Can you draw on your experience with them to respond to that?
Sure, and maybe I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction than you wanted it to go, so feel free to bring it back. But when I think about circularity, I think that oftentimes we get too focused on taking a biscuit tin and turning it back into a biscuit tin. And so when I think about circularity, if we take PET, for example, and the goals that we were talking about in terms of, 100% recycled content, well, and I don't know if this is the same in Europe as it is in North America, but over 50% of the PET that we collect goes into fiber. And so in order to get 100% of it back, you're going to have a way of taking that fiber and turning it back into those base building blocks that can be used to make PET. Glass is the same. Half of glass goes into fiberglass. So from that perspective, it's easier for glass, it's easier for metals. But I think from a vision point of view, as we think about circularity, we really have to think about those basic building blocks from these materials. So I don't think any one of the solutions in the survey can fulfill all the needs by themselves. I think you need multiple solutions. And that was something that just came out in the work that was done, funded by Pew and Systemic, where they talked about we can't recycle our way out of the plastic waste problem. We need all the solutions. And so from that perspective, I think sometimes we're trying to say that we can recycle materials and make them circular, which is really just not possible from a mechanical recycling point of view. And when you talked about decarbonization, I mean, there's a reason that 50% of the packaging is done in films from the perspective of low cost, high functionality, and protection of the product. And yet now we're saying that from a circular point of view, we have to make them all monolayer. In some ways that seems crazy to me. Are we like having one part of the system dictate the functionality through the rest of the system? So as I said, I maybe took that in a direction that you didn't want it to go, but I mean, I think that we do need to think about the function that the packaging performs, and we perhaps need to embrace technologies that allow us to have both. And by that, I do mean chemical recycling and recreating some of the chemical building blocks to recreate these materials.
Thank you, Nina. Erik, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good perspective, Nina, and I fully subscribe to that. I think it's so important to look at the materials as a raw material for new products, and that the packaging that we all of us are producing and using is a raw material for new products. But it doesn't necessarily have to become exactly the same thing, because as you say, I mean, you have losses along the whole recycling chain or the whole sort of post life cycle. And I think that's why, again, the original material choice is so important. And that's where we, as a company, have taken an active decision to move towards renewables and away from the fossil economy, because however we turn, I think that is a good starting point. And then those materials need to be produced in an efficient way and also to be recyclable, ultimately into new products, potentially into new packaging as well. I mean, there are regulations around this when it comes to food contact, for example, that makes a lot of materials not possible to use for food contact today when they're recycled. I think there are technical advances, as you mentioned, I mean, chemical recycling and similar processes that will allow that. But however you turn, you will have losses at every turn of that end of the life circle. So therefore, in order to make those losses from a carbon perspective as well as low as possible, we need to move to a renewable future, a plant-based future. I think that is the overriding part, and reduce our dependency of the fossil raw materials. So that is key for us. But at the same time, to make sure that the recycling happens. So again, it's back to the life cycle.
Gerald, would you like to
Yeah, actually, I've noted down quite a few points, and maybe, on some points I would even actually tend to disagree what Nina said. What you said, if we are pretty specific on the films, it's not about monolayer or multi-layer, but at least, we believe we can get to a point where we can make, and we are making flexible packaging, so we are making all of those high functionality, high barrier stuff. But basically, we are convinced we can get to a point where we can make all of that out of mono materials, not necessarily mono-layer with the same functionality. And the recent launch of the recyclable retort pouch is an example of that, where I don't think, you always need probably mono or different layers, but to get to a point, and when we talk about flexibles, it's polyolefins. Essentially, it's PE and PP that have a root in terms of mechanical recycling and have a prospect in terms of chemical recycling. So so I'm always saying in flexibles, polyolefins is that what PET has become in beverage bottles. So, because there was also an alignment process on that. And I really see that as a big time for the future. And I think we have the technology. Obviously, one needs to put the necessary innovation power behind it. Like, we have those requirements for every new pack in flexibles we make. It has to be kind of meet the monomaterial recyclability requirement, either for plastics, which is polyolefins, for metal, in our case, aluminum, or for paper, that it's then recyclable in the paper stream, in the real world. And I think that's what we should use as a target and link that with a life cycle approach. So have this and make sure that the new pack is from a life cycle, from a carbon life cycle approach, at least on the same level or even better. And honestly, we see when we make those switches, we really see that it normally even benefits the carbon balance as well. And because it's kind of a lower carbon material to start with, and actually, like Erik mentioned, you then also have the potential to include renewable content in these materials and keep it recyclable. So I think for us, it's really recyclability. We're talking about flexibles there. Reusability is not the big topic. It's maybe contributing via refill pouches, but Normally, it's focused on recycling, in selected cases also composting, if it's about composting food waste. And I think with that, we can really bring it together. And I would agree that chemical recycling can then help to get the material back to the same level. But in terms of input material, chemical recycling, also, if we talk at least about pyrolysis, which seems to be the direction things are going, they want polyolefins. They have the same requirements in mechanical recycling. So for me, that's quite a clear path for the industry, and that's independent even of technology developments.
Thank you, Gerald. And when we're looking at different circular opportunities in specifying some packaging system, would you say, panelists, that LCA is the best tool that you have available to make those decisions and inform those decisions? Or how would you look at that, Archana, as a brand owner?
Yeah, great question. Well, what we spoke about earlier was, the LCAs manage and they help to understand the life cycle impact of a product. But if you think about environmental impact holistically, that's about waste, that's about carbon, but that's also about things like water use, for instance, that we haven't really touched on here in this panel. So what we've developed internally is a proprietary tool called Sustainable from the Start. And what that allows us to do is measure the carbon, packaging, and waste and water impact of every piece of innovation that we put out in the market. It allows our product development teams across the board to take more informed decisions based on sustainability criteria, so that every package is actually sustainable, or the first consumer buys the first SKU off the shelf in the market. And I think that's increasingly where we will all be getting to in the future. We will all have to have the right data at our disposal to make the decisions, but we will also learn over time on the trade-offs that we have to make, looking at that data and the decisions that drives in the product development process.
Thank you, Archana. Nina, again, thinking about the experience of your organization and your members, what kind of tools are available at the moment, and do you think they're adequate?
Many years ago, Gerald mentioned Minimal Mystery, who was instrumental in developing a tool that the SBC had, that was the members were asking for an LCA light style tool. We no longer manage that tool. We found that as a nonprofit, it was very difficult to stay up with all of the investments that you need to keep making for that tool to be viable. But the Compass tool is still in the marketplace in the US, and it's a great way to get directional information. It's not for making marketing claims, but from the perspective of design, it's very helpful. The other thing that we have in the US, we have the How to Recycle label. And so many brands who want to know if their package is recyclable or not, we have an R&D function in that tool, so that if you're developing a new product and you want to find out what label it would get, as an R&D engineer, you can put that in up front and get feedback back on how recyclable your product is, and what are the other thing that the tool automatically does when anyone applies for a label. They also get information on what they could do to that product to make it more recyclable. So it might be a case of changing to a shrink sleeve that allows detection of the polymer underneath. It could be not using a paper label on a PET thermoform. I mean, it really depends on what the challenge is, but I think that tool's been seen to be very helpful from a design perspective, in addition to the LCA data. So you can look at both at the same time.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I guess one of my concerns over recent times has been the difficulty of objective benchmarking, particularly around carbon, because there are so many inputs and variables that can be manipulated in order to get the results that you want. And although we can acknowledge that there's no silver bullets, and that it very much depends on specific applications and variables within supply chains, we still need to have some kind of generalized understanding of relative carbon footprints of different systems. Does anyone have any thoughts about how we need to progress in terms of harmonized benchmarking?
Well, Tim, I can just make one comment when it comes to LCA methodology. I mean, it is a methodology. So, I mean, the origins are back in the 80s as starting out from, it's like an activity-based costing methodology. So you take inventory of all the different data that you need to collect, and then you get a result. And that result, as has been mentioned, carbon is one, the carbon footprint, the global warming potential is one. But normally in an LCA, you get 7, 8, 10 different impact categories. And I think that is important to remember, that it's not a sort of one trick pony. It's giving you results across the whole life cycle for a number of different parameters. And what that will show is there's not one solution, one sustainable package in this case. It depends on where you draw the borderlines, and also depends on how you make those definitions. But the most important use for it is I would say, first of all, it's for internal decision making, to make sure that we have the facts in front of us when we take decisions. So, for example, we've been pushing a lot, moving away from fossil plastics towards plant-based plastics, and that was based on the fact that we could see in every single LCA study we did, from a climate perspective, it is beneficial to go towards plant-based and avoid the use of fossil raw materials. And I think that is also an important realization that needs to come through all the way to policy today. Because when you look at packaging legislation today, and the circular economy, again, coming back to the recycled perspective, is that there's a lot of focus now on plastics and increasing taxes or fees on plastics. And then you will avoid that by having recycled content. But I would argue that it's equally important to at least level the playing field, so you get renewable content as well, because both are good decisions, but for different reasons. And I think that is where we see society is not really taking that full perspective into the decision making. So as companies, we use LCAs for our decision making, and I think we could share that with other key stakeholders like legislators. So you have a level playing field and an open view on the facts before you take a decision. So I think that's where LCAs can play an important role.
Thank you, Erik. I'd just like to remind the audience again that if you want to ask any questions to our panelists, then head to the Packaging Europe pages on LinkedIn or Twitter, and you can comment on the pinned post at the top of that page, or with the hashtag Sustainable Packaging Summit.
Tim, can I make another comment on LCA? And
absolutely.
I have to confess, I have a bit of background in LCA, so I did my PhD in that area. I think the biggest downfall or pitfall of LCA is honestly of not using it. And I think part of that is related to, I would say, a lot of scientists have not done a great job. It's always, when you get an LCA and then they focus on all the uncertainties, you can do fancy Monte Carlo analysis so that nobody understands anyway. But the message is, in the end, it's all very uncertain. And on the contrary, you always have a financial number that, if we talk about climate change, you have some activity and says, okay, this costs so much. That I would argue those financial numbers are a lot more uncertain than those LCA results, because they are just rough estimations, and people are just, let's say, used. If you have a number that people understand, it costs so many dollars, euros, then it seems to be clear, but it's not clear what is behind there. So I would say, obviously, LCA is not perfect, but I always say, let's say, a bad LCA is better than pretty much anything else. So I think it's good to put that into perspective. There are also standards around it. If you do a good job, there's an initiative on the EU level, the product environmental footprinting, which is in the end about making that a bit more robust and getting to a robust labeling system. And what we really do for nearly 15 years, we do LCA for all our products internally, like Erik said, and I think Archana also, for internal decision making. And then you can focus, if we go back to circular economy, on those solutions that actually bring an advantage to circular economy and also bring down the carbon footprint. And all our R&D people are using that. We have to have it externally certified by the Carbon Trust, so that you have some third-party view on that, because otherwise it doesn't help if you cheat yourself and basically make up things. So I think I also agree it's in this internal decision making, and then you can bring kind of objective life cycle focused data together with functionality, etc., and make the best decision. And again, it's about avoiding because sometimes you see this that to meet recyclability, let's say recyclability, sometimes you can have something like 5% or less of, because we talk about monomaterials, but obviously in reality, if you need a barrier, nothing is 100% mono. So, but if you have 95%, then you have some other materials in there that provide barrier, that provide functionality. So the solution cannot be, if you are, let's say, at 85% target material, okay, we make that thicker and then we meet the standard. That's more greenwashing, and you're actually wasting resources, energy, and contributing to climate change. So I think there's a good opportunity to bring it together, and LCA is just a good measuring stick. And if you do it with a good diligence and with common sense, then the results are quite reliable.
Thank you, Gerald. Let's move on the conversation now, and I'd like to talk about the role that collaboration can play in resolving our sustainability challenges and dilemmas, including this central dichotomy that we're talking about today. So I'd like to ask each of you in turn how your organization leverages collaboration to define its objectives and to work towards solutions. Could we start with Erik, please?
Sure. So collaboration, it's even a sustainable development goal. It's the 17th and last one that it sort of covers all the rest. So without collaboration, you won't get anywhere. So I think that's a fundamental perspective on this. And I think here it's a couple of things. First of all, for me, it is about a genuine interest and passion for where your products will end up. And that means that you need to be almost obsessed by the reality of your customers. So what's on top of your agenda as a customer? What are the key things that you are worried about? And then see how can we help contribute to improvements according to those key concerns. And in that, you also need to understand the bigger context with other stakeholders as well. So by developing an idea of what is that in the outside world of the key stakeholders, how can we work together to improve the performance from that perspective? And the other part is then looking behind you in the supply chain or in the value chain. So without collaborating with the best suppliers, there is very little you can do because you are dependent on the raw materials that you buy from your suppliers, and that those are produced in an increasingly sustainable and responsible way. And that can be through certifications like Forest Stewardship Council, Bonsucro, and so on, independent certifications, but also when it comes to the type of raw materials that you start to employ from those suppliers. So collaboration is inherent. Without that, I mean, you cannot solve this alone. You have to do it together along the value chain. It is a true partnership. That's the way forward for me.
Thanks, Erik. Archana, can I ask you next about collaboration? Do you see collaboration as primarily a sort of vector of the relationship with your suppliers?
I would go as far as saying collaboration is probably the most important thing that's going to help us all together solve this issue. The size and scale of the problem is such that none of us individually can solve it on our own. We work very closely with our suppliers, be it Amcor, Tetra Pak, many of our other suppliers. They're the ones who are driving a lot of material innovation, a lot of packaging innovation, and we want to be in a position to support a lot of that innovation and be able to bring that to market through our products. But equally, what's emerging is the importance of pre-competitive innovation with our peers. And it's not a topic that's comfortable for a lot of people within our organizations, even today. But it is really important. And if you think about the Pulpex bottle consortium with Diageo and Unilever, no one company can drive such big technology shifts, and we have to find a way to get together to drive the chain. But equally across the value chain, if you don't work together with waste management companies, with recyclers in this space, it's very difficult to then also influence policy and legislation. It's always easier to do it when you have a combined, united point of view that drives policy and legislation in the space. So I maintain, collaboration is probably the most important thing. Collaborative innovation is really what's going to drive a solution to this problem.
Thank you. Nina, you're in the position of being kind of at the center of one very large web of collaboration.
Yeah, I think of ourselves as a convener for collaborative projects is mainly the function and the role that we play. And with our members, there are many sort of common goals and shared objectives. And so we do run a number of collaboratives, and that's sort of the name of the individual projects. And they can range from the compostable packaging collaborative to verifying responsible sourcing to shipping liquids is a big deal from an e-commerce perspective. So there's a whole collaborative just around design for shipping liquids. Next markets, I mean, that's a huge problem, is establishing additional end markets for these materials. So there's a collaborative around next markets, and there's also one around flexible multi-layer packaging materials. So from that perspective, it is a way that we see bringing the industry together across the supply chain to push forward challenges. And we collaborate with other organizations as well as with our members to try and help bring that critical mass to some of these conversations to really create action.
Thanks, Nina. And Gerald, I know that you personally in your role are very active in various pre-competitive and value chain collaborations. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I agree with everything that was said before, and collaboration is now really going beyond the traditional collaboration supplier customer, where you work together on specific projects. And I agree that it's key. I would just say a bit word of warning. Collaboration is sometimes also used as a nice way to not change anything. So, we see, like we are very active in Ellen MacArthur Foundation and Consumer Goods Forum in CFlex, and sometimes you see a little bit of, even if I can talk about CFlex, where I'm part of the steering board, it has grown immensely. There are now over 160 or even 170 members. But what I said, I always stress, it's not an industry associations. We don't need to make everybody happy. Actually, if we are making everybody happy, we are not doing a good job, because then there is no change. So there is, I call it really needs to be a coalition of the willing. And, we have some, now let's say some stakeholders, we don't call them members in CFlex, that are not so happy because they are not fully really aligned with what we want to do if we're talking about changing materials to monomaterials, etc. And then, well, either they need to change their strategy, or quite frankly, they need to get out of C-Flex if they don't share that vision. So it's not, I think there we need to, there are enough companies who really want to make a change, and I'm sure the others will follow anyway. They won't have a choice, but I think we really, we need to make sure we kind of keep on that track. On C-Flex, we have a certain roadmap which comes along with commitments from the companies. And sometimes not everybody realizes what they have committed to in the end. But I think there we need to make sure that it's rather working with the front runners than trying to get everybody in the boat, because then you focus on the lowest common denominator and you don't change anything. So I think we really need to more focus this, coalition of the willing, those front runners who want to go ahead, and then the people who don't follow that, well, either they will follow at one time or they will have bigger problems.
That's a really interesting point you make, Gerald, about the difficulty of collaboration and in making difficult choices. And I had the privilege of sort of sitting in on a couple of the C-Flex meetings over the last couple of years, and there's some, among the willing leaders of this project, there's also quite difficult conversations sometimes to have, trade-offs that different links in the value chain need to make, compromises on specifications and things like that to create a coherent model for a circular economy. So we're getting towards the end of the broadcast, and I want to have time for some questions from the audience before we end. So I'd like to now come to our final discussion point and to pose a provocative question, and perhaps it's an uncomfortable question as well for all of us who are involved in packaging, but I think at the same time it's one that we'll be increasingly confronted with, and therefore we can't shy away from answering it. So I'd like to ask you whether it's true to see packaging sometimes as an enabler of environmentally damaging consumption. So by that I mean, does packaging that's optimized and as sustainable as it can be in terms of its own environmental impact, can that be an enabler of environmentally damaging consumption? Does it facilitate the supply and consumption of inherently unsustainable products? And I suppose this comes back to a point I think Erik made earlier, is that should we be thinking about the product as a whole rather than the packaged product, not just the packaging in isolation? Archana, could I ask you that first?
Sure. I love the comment that Gerald made earlier about packaging not being what it is, but what it does. And if you think about it within that frame, which is packaging has a role to play in protecting the product and keeping the product safe, you do have to then think about the product in its entirety, and then what is required to keep the product safe, and therefore what packaging is required. But again, from an environmental sustainability perspective, SodaStream is a great example. It still delivers carbonated soft drinks to consumers in the comfort of their home without any packaging. And that's a great example of completely rethinking a product to deliver a more sustainable solution, rather than just trying to optimize one little sliver of it, which is the packaging. Household care companies have done a great job of this as well. You get concentrated detergents, and all of that aims to make the whole product more sustainable, not just try and optimize the packaging. And I'm sure we're going to see a lot more innovation in this space going forward as well. So I think you're absolutely right. It's the product as a whole, and then what is the role that packaging can play or needs to play to support the product delivery, rather than optimizing packaging. It's a means, it's not an end. It's a means to delivering the product safely to the consumer. And as long as we think about it within that context, I think we'll drive the right innovation behavior.
Thank you. Nina, could I ask you to comment on this as well?
Well, I absolutely agree with what was just said. I think that that's absolutely critical. But I mean, there is back to one of the early points that Gerald made about sustainable development. And so, is there such a thing as sustainable consumption? I don't know, but I do think that packaging is symptomatic of choices that we make and other sort of lifestyle choices. And so it's almost that early warning system that is showing us that we are perhaps consuming too much as individuals. And therefore, if we look at it in the context of, is this giving us an insight into how we might change our behaviors so that we can live more sustainably? And I think that, and Bill McDonough does a great job of talking about, sustainable. That's not enough. We need to think about being regenerative and moving beyond sort of basic level sustainability. And what does that look like? Well, some of the constraints that we have today, like energy, well, what if energy becomes abundant? What if energy is renewable? What if materials are renewable? Does that change how we think about consumption and regenerative behavior? So I think it's a bigger conversation than just the package.
Thanks, Nina. Erik, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think your original question, Tim, it was on unsustainable consumption, and I think I love the comments from you, Nina. I fully subscribe to that, because and I think for me the most unsustainable consumption is when you get a product and you don't use it, you just throw it away. So it's fundamentally it is about product waste, and I think that is where packaging plays a huge role, especially when it comes to foods. So and the job that the package has to do is to deliver it safely and in the right amounts to the right consumer at the right time, so that it can be consumed. But if you fail in any one of those tasks, that product will be poured out or thrown away, and that is totally unsustainable. So we just simply cannot afford to continue to waste as much food as we do today in the world. I mean, as much as or even more than 30% of the food produced on this planet is not reaching the end goal, which is about human nutrition. So there's a lot of work to be done there. Having said that, I think it's also looking ahead. And in this situation now, during the pandemic, I think one perspective that I keep coming back to, and that it's sort of crystallizing out of this, is the concept of resilience, which is, I think, is the next iteration of sustainability. So sustainability has become a buzzword almost to the point where you throw it around like, you don't really know what it means anymore. But for me, I think it's moving more as a society, moving more towards a resilient solution, meaning that we're able to withstand the shocks of the future that undoubtedly are going to come. And I think here is where packaging has a key role to play. So instead of talking about bad packaging or unsustainable packaging, you need to look at the job it has to do as part of a more resilient future. So I think honestly, if we look at it that way, I think there's a great future for the packaging industry. But again, coming back to the decision making, it's all down to the decisions that we take as individuals and as companies that would decide the path for us. And yeah, there are important decisions to be made today and even more so in the future.
Thank you, Erik. And Gerald, we'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I think most things were really said. I think, Tim, I understood your question also a bit of, questioning certain products as such or certain, and I agree. I think if we are serious about sustainability or sustainable development, you have to ask, let's say on a private level, it's like, is it really necessary to fly across Europe or the US for the weekend for $100 or whatever? Is that really necessary? Or do I really need strawberries in winter? Like, personally, I said, you could have a great package that delivers that from wherever to where I live. But I think it's probably something I think that will anyway probably change. These things will get under pressure. So it doesn't mean that local food is necessarily better. That can also be a myth. But the point is, I think the industry has a role to play to also educate the consumer about what is a good decision. And I think if we talk about the industries we are in, like food, pharmaceuticals, you actually have key aspects that are, it's a product in most cases that is really needed. I think where people have to rethink in home and personal care, sometimes in cosmetics, you have stuff that is kind of over packaged, that's part of the product selling, or things like if you ever notice, the more expensive the wine, the heavier the glass bottle. I mean, the empty glass bottle. Where sometimes if you have a really nice wine, you say, is that a Magnum bottle? No, it's just as heavy. Where you say, I think that should really be questioned to say, okay, what is really needed, and do we need, let's say, over packaging just for the sake of perception?
Thank you. Yes. Fine. Well, let's move over now to the questions from our audience. One very pertinent question we've received is about the impact of COVID on sustainability and our basic objectives. And I suppose I'd like to frame this in consumer attitudes to sustainability. Nina, I'll ask you about this first. We know that a lot of the progress that's been made on sustainability within packaged goods has been driven by consumer concern about waste and ocean plastics and things like this. And I'm sure from all of our personal experiences, we know that our lives and behavior has changed enormously over the last I've lost track of time now. I have no idea how long this new phase of history has gone, but since the start of the pandemic, we obviously we're ordering a lot more e-commerce. That's one big change to the way we consume goods, and with profound implications for packaging. But also, my wife, for example, insists on quarantining our shopping every week. It goes into a special holding zone before we're able to touch it, or we spray it. I think it's very likely that consumer attitudes have shifted very much in terms of how they value packaging, how the relative position of sustainability in their thoughts around packaging. Have you had any feedback from your members about this?
Well, actually, at our recent fall member meeting, Susan Shelton from the Shelton Group presented a year ago. She had done research, and it was surprising because consumers felt they could do more about plastic in the ocean than they could about climate change. And that was kind of a strange finding, but then when you realize that they can see the plastic in the ocean and therefore they do feel empowered to do something about it. With COVID, she redid the analysis, and both, unfortunately, climate change and plastic in the ocean had dropped considerably from their mindset, and it was much more about health and safety around the situation of COVID. So, I mean, her point was that we have to keep talking about these things for when they come back. I do think that there were some changes in our programs. Some of the bottle bill states stopped collecting for a while. There are a number of recycling programs that have stopped. And so consumers have seen that as a response. But I do think the industry has recognized that this is a raw material supply chain, and that it's critical to keep it operating as opposed to allow it to be interrupted and stopped. So those are some of the things that consumers might have seen, but I haven't heard as much. Initially, there were talks about, oh, can we make a package that would have some sort of, it's not an antimicrobial, but something that would make it safer. And that conversation died down relatively quickly, that no, that's not really a direction that we should be going in. So a variety of different reactions. Not sure that answered your question, but.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any insights on COVID and its impact on sustainability priorities for packaging?
Just a short one, Tim. I mean, what we can see is some of them shift towards longer shelf life products. So people tend to buy more at one single location and therefore are looking for products that has a longer shelf life. It's just the way it is right now. And I think we can see it in our sales, at least, that is a tendency, absolutely.
And I think from our perspective, one of the things we've seen is this pandemic has driven a massive recognition in the fact that the food systems are fragile, and we need to set up overall more resilient food systems going forward. And obviously packaging plays a really, really important role in setting up those food systems. And prior to this, if anyone had told me we'd be running out of pasta in a supermarket, it would have been unimaginable to think that. So the whole fragility of the food system has been called into real question on account of this pandemic, and packaging obviously plays a really important role in defining that. And the other thing we're seeing is the impact of climate change, but also making it more visible through things like cleaner air pollution. You see the sort of before and after pictures of the London skyline. It's suddenly making it more tangible to people. Ocean waste has always been top of the priority list from a mass consumer perspective because people can see it. People know what to do about it. It's always been a tangible problem. What the pandemic has done is it started to make climate change, it started to make air pollution, some of those issues more tangible as well from an overall sustainability perspective. So I think those are some of the big shifts we're seeing. And we always say transformation always comes out of a crisis. So I'm hopeful that with the EU support of green recovery, etc., that we will come out as at least as a Europe unit, stronger from this crisis.
Yes, and I would also hope that the public's understanding that packaging, this greater consciousness of the protective role that packaging plays may feed into a more sort of nuanced and sophisticated appreciation of what packaging is, and not as a way of basically saying, okay, packaging is good, it used to be bad and now it's good, but at least to feed into a more complicated understanding of the environmental issues around packaging, and including the carbon, the role it plays in decarbonization and things like this. And I suppose another comment I would make is that I think we all know that around the packaging industry, efforts were made to improve resource efficiency, and the work on the sustainability, the circular economy were already happening before it suddenly became the #1 item on the news agenda. And I think it's important to recognize that even if the consumers' attention shifts away from sustainability for a while because they've got more immediate worries, that it's very important for us all to continue to push that, drive that work forward. Gerald, did you have anything that you wanted to say about COVID?
Yeah, I think the point is, like was mentioned, I think when it started, there were, let's say, some industry voices who said, okay, now people will appreciate the value of plastics. Obviously, I think that has brought that a bit, but I think it hasn't taken the focus on what needs to happen. I would even say it has accelerated a lot of the work. And like Archana said, it's really about this green recovery plan. Europe has really realized that kind of rebuilding or even fighting climate change, we need something seriously. If they say by was it 40, I think 2050, carbon neutral, with all the measures on circular economy, I think that's only, I think their COVID is really only accelerating that. I would say the good news is, as even China has now committed to 20 2060, basically to do the same. So it gets more into a race into, who can do this faster and then has a competitive advantage in the medium term versus who moves first loses, which was a bit in the past. And I think that's only accelerating. And I don't really see the attention moving away from that, because I think, Archana, you mentioned that people appreciate more that humans don't have everything under control, and that you can just find a tech. So with the virus, you see how vulnerable and basically how helpless we are. And I think people realize that in climate change and other things. So I think there will be some changes, and I think the long term, it honestly should only be positive.
Thanks, Gerald. There's another question we have here from Gaurav Kale. He is asking about the context of consumer education and provision of tools to help consumers effectively close the loop in packaging. It's an important context, isn't it? That consumers often drive what's happening, and consumer education has often been lacking from our point of view. Any comments on the significance of this and the progress that we can make?
Yeah, from a branded company perspective, we touch millions and millions of consumers every day. And so we actually see it as our responsibility to also educate consumers. So even if it's small things like, putting the right recycling messages on our packaging, nudging consumers to recycle, we think all of that is critical. But equally supporting industry-led education schemes like CTO runs in France, or supporting Recopol in Poland with their education schemes in schools, etc. We think that is absolutely critical, and that's where brands like ours that touch so many people on an everyday basis can actually play a really important and a critical role.
Thank you, Archana. Right, we're going to run out of time quite soon, so I think rather than having long discussions for each one, I'd like to try and quickly get to another 2 questions, and apologies to the members of the audience who we won't have time to respond to. We've had 2 questions about biodegradable packaging and the role that plays and its sustainability credentials. Who would like to make a comment about biodegradability and obviously this is a contentious area. Is it something where it's positive that we're solving the waste problem, or is it a loss of valuable materials because we're not recovering them? Nina, I think you're primed to answer. Yeah.
I'm happy to chat about that. And I like to use the word compostable rather than biodegradable, because I like to bound the degradation by sort of time and temperature constraints and a standard. I think biodegradable is used interchangeably sometimes, and that is not helpful. But from the perspective of compostable packaging, I mean, we think it absolutely makes sense when you are trying to capture food waste. So from the perspective of a vehicle for delivery of food waste to compost facilities, compostable packaging is that great enabler. It absolutely doesn't make sense to use compostable packaging in other application areas, because the composters don't want the packaging, they want the food that comes with it. So if we sort of recognize that as the boundary, then as we start to build that infrastructure, it is an alternate pathway that materials can go. The thing that's really different, and we've been chatting about this internally at the coalition, is the product is uncoupled from the industry. So the folks that end up buying the compost, it tends to be agriculture. It's not like a brand would buy back compost to use it to drive the market for that material. So it has a different set of drivers with it that we have to understand, that if we want to influence that area, it's not quite the same as making a recycled content commitment. compostability has those different drivers. But yes, it is a viable option in applications where food waste is being delivered.
Thank you, Nina.
Just one comment there, Tim. I think from my perspective, I think biodegradability or compostability, I think from a consumer perspective, has risen on the agenda because of the discussions around ocean plastics and concerns there, which is understandable. But at the same time, I think, to take that in a circular economy approach, I think it's much more long-term resilient to focus on recyclability rather than compostability or biodegradability, at least for our type of applications. Because for us, if we would use biodegradable or compostable materials, it would really be linear. You take it, you use it, and then you put it for degradation. Whereas we think of more closing the loops and recycling those materials. But that is for our perspective or our situation. I'm sure there are situations where it could make sense. Not for us though.
And we definitely don't want litter-friendly packaging. I mean, that from that perspective, that's a non-starter. So recognizing that packaging doesn't just disappear, and that we shouldn't be designing for that possibility.
Yes, indeed. I will give a plug to a really great event that's not one of ours. It's the European Bioplastics Conference. Actually, takes place quite soon, from 30th of November to 3rd of December, and I've always found that a really enlightening event to attend in terms of shedding light on both compostable and bio-based plastic. Obviously, we're talking not just about compostables, but traditional plastics that can be made from bio feedstocks. So do check that out if you're interested in going into that in more depth. So one final question we have from Päivi Luoma, who I guess is from Finland, but from the name. What about new digital technologies like in IoT, data platforms, blockchain, AI, etc.? How could they help us make more sustainable choices in packaging? Do any of you have any thoughts on that?
I assume it relates to, I would assume, the question is quite generic. It relates to collection, sorting into food grade, whatever. I think, yeah, they can have a role. There's, for instance, the project, Holy Grail, to sort plastics, let's say, even further, or other materials into, again, food grade specifications, relatively based on existing technology. So I think there are obviously solutions for that. I would just warn, in the end, the things that need to happen are, simple collection mechanisms like, curbside, household collection, powerful sorting and recycling infrastructure. And the heavy lifting is not in the high tech. The heavy lifting is really in getting it done. So I think then high tech can help to facilitate this. But again, one should not wait for a solution, because we really need a solution now. I think all the companies here on the panel have commitments that go to 2025. So something that's not mainstream technology today will not be 2025 or 2030. I think they can support, but they are not the solution as such.
I can make one comment there, Tim, and I think I'd rather look more upstream than Gerald. I would look at the supply chain and the transparency of the raw materials that we're using, and making that available to a greater public. So, and with that transparency also comes a much bigger responsibility. So that the decisions that we take on material use, that's done in a responsible and sustainable way. So by making that information available to a wider public, I think we should also expect a lot of more questions, and therefore the decisions we take are so important that we feel confident that we've taken a strong decision. So I think digitalization can absolutely play a role there, and I think sustainability-wise, we will benefit from it, because then you will lay bare those weaknesses that you might have in your supply chain. So you have to start working on it. So there, I think it has a big role to play.
Thank you. Just to add, one example that springs to my mind is one of the winners of the Sustainability Awards last year was a really great collaborative project by the Plastic Bank and Henkel in Europe, where blockchain technology was used to enable a whole kind of mini economy whereby in developing countries, starting in Haiti, they were able to incentivize and reward local litter pickers to divert packaging from landfill and the environment, recover valuable materials, and to use that blockchain technology to directly pay and reward the pickers, where in many developing countries you find that there's a middleman who basically takes all of the money from pickers, and the people who are actually doing the work are remaining in deep poverty. So that's one example where in the absence of the kinds of more developed collection systems we have in Europe and North America, it's been able to make quite a significant environmental and societal contribution. So unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. I very much hope you've enjoyed our discussion. Over the next 6 weeks, we'll be hosting lots more panels, workshops, and networking events in this virtual Sustainable Packaging Summit, and you're very welcome to join all of them. Just to mention briefly, next week we have 3 events. On the 2nd of November at 1 o'clock Brussels time, we have a workshop hosted by Michael Neuwestieg of the NVC Netherlands Packaging Center, talking about Puma. It's a new manifesto and methodology to look to end packaging as an environmental issue. The following day, on the 3rd of November at the same time, we have a panel discussing reusable packaging models featuring Tom Saki from TerraCycle, Annette Lendahl of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, Guido Aufdenkamp from Flexible Packaging Europe, and Guiander Belder from Procter & Gamble. And on the 5th of November at midday Brussels time, we have a panel looking at how we can bring together design for recycling and end-of-life requirements in flexible packaging. We've talked quite a lot about C-Flex today, and this is very much burrowing into the work that C-Flex and the wider flexibles value chain is doing. So hope some of you will be interested in some of those next week. We'll also be rolling out some networking functions and sharing more content on this platform, and we hope that enriches your experience of the summit. Thank you now to our 4 fantastic panelists. Thanks very much for joining us and sharing your knowledge.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot.
Hey, Tim.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And thank you very much to our audience for tuning in. Goodbye.